Welcome to the HMO Property Show. By investors, for investors. Catch us weekly as we discuss all things cash flow positive property investing. Whether you're a seasoned investor, a new landlord, or just curious about property investing, this is the podcast for you. Sponsored by the Co-Living Collective, your trusted partner in creating vibrant and sustainable shared living experiences. Visit us at colivingcollective.com.au to learn more.
Welcome back to the HMO Property Show. I'm your host, Neil Gibb, as always. And today I've got a very special guest who's come all the way from Victoria to join me. I'd love to say he's flown in specifically for the podcast, but he's here for the cricket. So we killed two birds with one stone. It's Mr. Robert Pradolin. Robert, Neil, welcome to the podcast.
No, thank you very much.
When we found you on LinkedIn, it was through the title that you had on your LinkedIn. And then we started digging a little bit deeper and we found there's so many synergies between what we're doing and trying to achieve and what you are doing and have done as well, because you've achieved, from what I can see, some really good outcomes so far in Victoria and just happened in Western Australia too. So congratulations. We'll dig into it so that the listeners have a little bit more about it. But for the listeners, who is Robert Pradolin?
Where do I start? At the moment, I'm a former property developer. I used to be involved with Australand or Frasers, that they're called now. And as I normally say, part of this history, it's this interest in this area, which is social affordable housing and homelessness, is that when I was selling apartments, housing and land to the private sector, people that could afford it, like most Australians, I assumed our governments were looking after our vulnerable people. And I found out that they weren't. And I'm meant to know because I'm in the industry. So I said, I wonder how many other people in the Australian public actually understand what this issue is. And the more I delved into it, the more I could see this time bomb for our grandkids that we are allowing to happen because we're normalising things like homelessness that it shouldn't be allowed to actually happen. And I'm going to state up front, I am a capitalist, but it doesn't mean I don't care about vulnerable people. And what I've discovered, and this is through Housing All Australians, because we're in every state and territory except Northern Territory with business people that care, I now term them compassionate capitalists. Because we are business people that need to make a buck to sustain and to actually employ people, but we actually care. And the analogy that, again, the more I delve into that, philanthropy in 2022, $30.5 billion of philanthropy. Now, what's philanthropy? Compassionate capitalists that have been successful, that want to give back. So I think we need to call it for what it is. We are living in a capitalist society, but in Australia, we actually care. And I think we're going to chance to change this before it's too late.
Yes, brilliant. Thank you. That was a good intro. You've got a few titles currently. You're the Executive Director of Housing All Australians, that's what grabbed my attention. You're also the Director of Quiplex. You've fallen under your own developer banner of Robert Pradolin.
Yep. And
board member of Summer Housing as well. So I do a little bit in the disability space.
Yep.
Awesome. And you mentioned there you worked for Frasers. That was for 18 years, right?
Yes. It used to be called Australand and they got acquired by Frasers, yes, for 18 years.
Were you involved in any projects in Perth with Frasers?
Oh, I only touched on it when I had an executive general manager role, but more so in Victoria, which is where I was basically based. But yes, I know Frasers was WA as well.
Yeah, great. So Housing All Australians, first of all, the title just says it all really, doesn't it? Why? You mentioned on it there, you realised when you were in the private sector, you've seen there was an issue. When and how did you get the passion and the drive to establish Housing All Australians, and what are the outcomes that you're achieving so far?
Yeah, look, it's all these things take time, and there's no one single element to it because it all makes up of a number of small little events in your life. But the one that was the turning point was I was having a cup of coffee with my daughter in De Grave Street, which is opposite Flinders Street Station. And obviously Flinders Street Station people are sleeping rough beneath the station. But a few days earlier in the news, there was a story about how the Grand Hall above Flinders Street Station was empty for 10 years. And I asked my daughter a rhetorical question. I wonder how many buildings in Melbourne are empty. Because a homeless guy came up and asked us for some money, and we gave him a few coins and it started this conversation. So since that conversation, I've started working with the City of Melbourne and a not-for-profit called Launch Housing, trying to find empty office buildings just to get people out of the weather. And I got a phone call one day from the City of Melbourne saying, look, the ABC News has heard about the idea and they like it. They want to run a story. And I said, but we haven't found a building yet. But like I've always done through my career, always returned the journalist's call, even if I had no comment. And I said to him, look, thank you for supporting the idea, but we haven't found a building yet. And the guy said, no problems, because the ABC headquarters in South Bank was undergoing renovations. He said, let's pretend that's one of your empty buildings. So we were on the news that night. Then the guy called Neil Mitchell was on the radio, saw it, got me in to talk about it. So I spent a bit of talkback radio. Then I started getting calls from a range of people, from a very wealthy family all the way through to a homeless guy that found me on LinkedIn and said, I'm one of the great unwashed. Thank you for trying. And everyone in between. And they said roughly the same thing. We know we've got a problem. Just tell us what you want us to do. And that started off the whole Housing All Australians journey. And then I met, through my wife, my now wife, I met a lady called Lisa Kingman. And she said, Rob, because I don't like writing things down. I just want to get action done. She said, you need to sit down and write a strategy. So we wrote a one-page strategy about what we wanted to try and achieve. Economic study, using existing buildings as a short-term shelter, an economic model that allows the private sector to drive these things, and unlocking government and not-for-profit land. Mm-hmm. And then at the end, where you put the one-page strategy, she said, so what do you want to call the strategy? Call it what it is, Housing All Australians. And then after that, through, again, business acquaintance, I met a lady called Louise Rutten, who's our current chair. And so together, this journey, we actually decided to form Housing All Australians as an entity and see how many other private sector people are out there that share the same values. And I'm going to tell you, I am overwhelmed by how many compassionate capitalists exist through this country. And we are in every state and territory, as I said before, except Northern Territory. And that's probably because we haven't been there yet. But these are all about people that actually care. So, look, I can talk for a long time about this subject because I'm so passionate about it, not for us, but for our grandkids. Because if we allow it to continue, they will be living in a different country.
Yeah, true. Very true. How do we fix the problem then?
Slowly. It has taken 30 to 40 years to get here. We have not had a housing crisis that's actually happened overnight. It's a slow erosion of our value system. It's a social cohesion issue. It happens so that we get normalised and therefore we expect it. And just to show that point, I read a book a year or so ago called Homelessness is a Housing Problem by a guy called Greg Colburn from the US. And he's researched the US housing market. And one line of his book stuck out to me because in New York on one night, 78,000 people are either on the street or in crisis accommodation. In Australia, the ABS said on one night, 122,000 across the whole country, including people sleeping on couches, which the US figure does not include. So our homelessness population across Australia is as large as what New York's is. We do not want to become America. We can still solve it. It's not over. It's not big enough to be unsolvable like some of the states are. So based on that, I contacted him, and we as Housing All Australia brought him over. And we did a tour of Sydney, Melbourne, and Perth. Melbourne was sold out because that's where we're basically based, with compassionate capitalists that listened to demystifying homelessness. It's not about alcohol and drugs, even though that's some of the causes. It's house prices. And it was a standout success. We're actually videotaped the Melbourne event, and it's on our webpage under HAA TV. Any of your listeners, have a look at it. It changes your perception about homelessness. But part of what I'm also saying that is that I accompanied him through Australia, and he walked through Sydney and Melbourne. He said, Rob, you guys are the same as us 20 years ago. You've got 20 years to fix this, otherwise you'll be as bad as America. So his parting line to all the audience, don't repeat our mistakes. Learn from what we didn't do and learn that there's a size of the problem and the solution has to be commensurate with the size of the problem. But don't let it happen in Australia.
And what was the thing that they didn't do?
They didn't address the problem with the scale it needed.
Right.
In fact, one of the anecdotes that you'll hear on his story is that in the specific state, and I can't remember which one it was, they spent $5 billion on homelessness, and the politician said to Greg, Greg, we spent $5 billion on homelessness and we haven't solved it. Well, because $5 billion doesn't address the size of the problem. In Australia, the federal government's already identified this in 2021 through federal government actuaries as a $290 billion shortfall over the next 20 years in social affordable housing.
It's crazy.
That is a spend of $14.5 billion every year for 20 years. If we look at what's happened the last couple of years with the Housing Australia, how much are we spending and how many years it's taking? It is only a drop in the ocean. We are not tackling the problem based on its size. And if you don't have a strategy that addresses the size of the problem, you will never solve it. And, we've got to be realists. We're from the private sector, Governments do not innovate. We innovate, right? Yeah. Governments look at 3 and 4 year terms. We look at long-term strategies. We have to reshape this conversation in the interest of the long-term interest of this country, in the interest of our grandkids, because otherwise, as I said earlier, we're leaving a different country where they'll be unsafe to walk down the street.
Yeah. As I was going through your website and LinkedIn and other platforms that you've got, I noticed that I've just got a thing saying SD card has limited space left, 13 minutes left. Damn it. Hang on.
All right.
We've got 30 minutes left on the card. We'll see how we go.
Yeah.
Cut that bit out, yeah?
Yeah.
While I was going through your website, there's a few quotes that were on there, like this problem is too big for the government to fix. We've been saying that for a long time. That's why we're trying to entice investors to come on board with us. And, we call it impact invest. I'm sure you've heard the term before. So they can make some money while they're doing good and then reinvest that profit if they may into more housing. We can only work with so many mum and dad investors, right? And we've been trying to target business owners, like you said, they're compassionate capitalists. Once you've got them all in the room with the tour that you did, what was the conversation that you've had with them and what has the outcome been since?
Well, most of them said this is the best presentation they've ever heard about learning about housing and homelessness. They all want to help because they, again, compassionate capitalists. Given the size of this problem being $290 billion, unless it's economically viable, it will never be solved. And again, it's only getting a reasonable return for risk. Unfortunately, we've allowed profit to become tainted by, you're all greedy bastards. When really all profit does, it makes your business sustainable so you can employ more people and actually serve society. Because ultimately, every business serves society. But there is a desire in there. People think it's too big to solve as well. It's a big problem. It's too big for government to solve without the private sector, but the private sector also think it's a too big a problem because they're waiting for government.
Yeah.
We can't afford to wait for government. We need business leaders that innovate, that are prepared to take a little bit of a risk in the long-term interest. But you have to make a buck, otherwise you go broke, and therefore you can't do what you're meant to do. So it is a vicious circle. It is a community problem, not a government problem, and part of the community is business. And part of what we're doing with refurbishing existing buildings, because there's thousands of buildings sitting there vacant, waiting for the next development cycle.
All across the country.
Why can't we use them as short-term shelter while that timing happens? And again, it's not a solution, but we need a pressure relief valve. These existing buildings can be refurbished by the private sector and given to a not-for-profit to help people. The first one we did in Victoria, 32 rooms of an old 52-room aged care facility. Metricon and all their staff helped to refurbish those 32 rooms and we gave it to the YWCA. Over 4 years, they've helped over 140 women stabilise their lives at zero capital cost to government. Hanson Youngkin's now doing the next 20 rooms of that 52-room facility. Mirvac's just finished 12 in St Kilda. Henley Homes has just finished 12 in Sandringham. Better Living Group did 31 empty apartments in South Melbourne. Now you say, why are they empty? Well, the not-for-profit that owned them applied to the state to have money to refurbish them. And the state said, sorry, we've only got money for new buildings, not for refurbishments. Yet they're 80% complete. How does that make sense?
Crazy, isn't it?
And I think there's thousands across the country. So that's one pressure relief valve. The other one as well is that there's 13 million empty bedrooms in this country.
Yep.
Now, it's not a full solution. 1% is 138,000, right? So if you say, let's unlock these for essential workers close to where they serve society, and you'd think, when you're thinking about it, that these empty bedrooms, a lot of pensioners would own it because they bought their house a long time ago, so they're probably in a very good location, right? But the pensioners have been advised saying, you can't get it, you can't actually lease that room out because if you do, you lose your pensions and your capital gains tax status. Hey, let's keep them locked up. We're in a war with housing. We have to declare war on this so enemies come together and do something in the national interest. We need to unlock these empty bedrooms, unlock these disused buildings as a short-term pressure relief valve while we build the housing our country needs. But that's not how governments think, and we have to change that by sharing some of these thoughts and creating what I'm terming respectful unrest. Because respectful unrest is about educating people about what they don't know. But if you get a respectful unrest, you get political self-interest. And then that drives the ballot box. And that's, at the end of the day, how the system works.
Let's talk about educating people about what they don't know. Who are the homeless that we're trying to house nowadays? Because the perception and the reality, from my understanding, are two totally different things. What's your point of view on that?
Look, the reality is all cohorts are suffering. But one of the ones that we sort of stumbled on purely because the first pop-up shelter, we had to convince the board of that not-for-profit to allow us to refurbish it to house homeless people. And initially they thought we were going to house the homeless guy on ice. And then by the time they whittled away, the most safest cohort for them, because that way it wouldn't affect the neighbours much, is women over 50. So the first one we did was women over 50 because the board of the not-for-profit didn't want to risk the perception and the backlash by the community to put someone on drugs in there. Now, it wasn't what we were intending to do anyhow, but we had to mitigate their risk. But what that exposed me to is that women over 50 are the fastest growing cohort of homeless in this country. As a man, I was ashamed about that. They're sleeping in cars. And through that journey, we came across a director and a producer that wanted to do a film about this, a documentary. It's actually called Undercover. It's actually got finished. Margot Robbie narrated it. And as of November this year, it's now on Netflix. So if I want to encourage all your listeners to look up Undercover on Netflix, it's a story about women over 50 in Australia. We play a very small part in it to show what we're doing with one refurbished buildings. And this is where the compassionate capitalism comes out across the country. We've got people approaching us after seeing this film saying, how do we help you? How do we help our fellow Australians to actually have a fundamental human need met? Because without that fundamental human need, we have unintended human consequences that manifest in physical and mental health, family violence, the justice system, the policing system, and ultimately long-term welfare dependency. But with the roof over someone's head, they can become a taxpayer. We have to look at this from a social and economic point of view. Otherwise, we just destroy our country very, very slowly.
I agree. What about the essential workers? I've seen you noted that under the PRADS system, which we'll talk about in a second, you talk about providing housing for essential workers. Where do they sit in the homelessness sector currently?
Well, this whole housing crisis is a housing continuum problem. Then there's a section called non-market housing, which means if it requires $1 of subsidy, the private sector will not deliver it. And this is where essential workers sit in, because essential workers we need to serve the society, whether you're a police, nurse, teacher, or a barista, it's all part of the services that society needs. But because of affordability, we're pushing further and further and further out, that they don't come in to actually provide those services. So business is very inefficient. In fact, there's a group in Queensland, it's a public listed business in the meat abattoirs. They are only 60% efficient because they can't find enough workers to service the abattoir. This is now a business problem. So essential workers are the ones that's closest to the market viability. And that's the one the private sector should focus on, because the other side, the social housing, is heavily subsidised, which is where the government should actually focus on. But if you think of it as a housing continuum, if we do not create enough essential worker housing, which requires a subsidy of some sort, in the long term, people will continue to drop into homelessness because of house prices. So we have to go upstream and create enough supply to stop the downstream homelessness from happening. But it requires at the moment both to be done at the same time if in the longer term we're going to actually reduce this issue.
Yeah, I agree there. So in regards to the businesses that are being efficient, what we noticed where my wife and I go down south to Margaret River region, there's a lot of businesses that have got signs on the doors right now saying we are understaffed. Please bear with us. We haven't got enough people here. There's a massive housing shortage down there. It's even harder to build houses in the south than it is in the metro area. So I understand the issue with the abattoir there that you're talking about in Queensland. It's Australia-wide, isn't it?
Australia-wide.
Businesses are struggling. Some businesses are actually shutting down because it's just too hard for them to run the business on their own.
Correct. Even in Victoria, there's a couple of examples of the famous cafe in Dalesford, which is the country, that end up buying an old aged care facility and fitting it out and providing accommodation for their staff.
Yeah.
The Sorrento Hotel in the Mornington Peninsula bought an old aged care facility to fit it out for low income accommodation for their staff.
Yeah.
This is a business problem across the country. Regional Australia is doing it tough. And, essential workers are required everywhere. And yes, there's a skill shortage and all that. We understand that. But we have to actually look at how we can solve the problem in the short, medium and long term. There is absolutely no silver bullet on this. But ignoring it and just trying for an idealistic solution that takes years is not addressing the problem. Let's sweat our existing infrastructure that's already built in a smarter way as a short-term solution. And then we can take the 5 years to build the homes, because that's what it's going to take. We can then mobilise private sector capital. We can invest in prefabrication, which must be part of the solution, especially timber, because it's low carbon. It's got a whole range of benefits. But we need to think outside of a 3 and 4 year political cycle. But that doesn't suit the political self-interest of any party. And that's part of our problem.
True. Touch on building methods there. Over in the West here, we love a bit of double brick. Victoria, though, you guys like timber, don't you?
We like timber. Yeah, double brick, I know, is something that WA is ingrained in your culture.
We love it, mate. We're trying our best to change it. We've got a few steel frame houses, a few timber frame going up as well. But the majority of them is brick. And we're finding that a lot of builders just don't have the skill set again, or the trade skill set to build timber frame and steel frame houses. So again, we've got a skill shortage, but we haven't got the people here to build the houses to a different construction methodology.
Yeah, so it's a bit of a catch-22 in some respects. Technically, where you need to invest in the TAFEs of the world with a bit of a longer-term strategy. Again, this has not happened overnight. And again, I don't put any political aspirations on anybody because this happens on both sides, but someone's going to look at the long-term strategic issues of the country. That's why we want to invest in education, to make sure that the trades are coming out in the volumes that we need them. Encourage the kids to pursue a TAFE training rather than just university. And I'm a university graduate. Yes, my father was an immigrant, pushed us all to go to university, and that's great. But now we've got a bit of a trade shortage as well. So someone's going to think of the long term, and I just don't think we're doing it enough.
Is being a tradesman attractive to the young kids coming through nowadays? Because when I was coming through, it was when I used to see people building houses and it used to get me excited. I was an electrician by trade before I got into real estate. But I feel like the kids that are coming through now, there's so many digital things that you can do, social media marketing manager, and that wasn't a thing when I was younger. YouTube, being an influencer, all these type of things that weren't available when I was younger. And I feel like a lot of the younger generation that are coming through now want that lifestyle, and because it's been promoted that you can start a YouTube channel and potentially live on the beach in Bali or something like that.
Sounds great. I'd love to do that.
Me too, mate. If you work it out, let me know. But how do we convince the younger generation coming through that being a tradesperson is a good outcome and can provide a really good lifestyle? I ended up in this country because I was an electrician.
Right.
So I will always be grateful for my trade that I had.
Yeah, look, that's a difficult one because it is all about marketing and having role models that you want to try and follow, and having a purpose in life. You have to actually enjoy these things too. As I've said to many times to my kids, and they're sick of me saying it, is that I don't think I've worked many days in my life because I found something I love to do.
Yeah.
And that's actually quite a fortunate position. So we need to be putting people up and admiring success. Not the tall poppy syndrome that says we're going to get you off that bloody ledge, And aspirations, there's nothing wrong with that. And a capitalist society where people aspire to do things that are better than what they would if they didn't do anything is not a bad principle, but we've allowed it to be tainted by the far right that are all, these are all greedy bastards up here, but the reality is that in Australia our culture's slightly different. We actually are very generous as a country. When we have a crisis, the amount of assistance and money flows quite easily in Australia because we do care. We then forget very quickly as well. Yeah, and we have to be careful we don't let that be eroded by the social dislocation that's actually currently happening here, because it does happen very, very slowly. But getting back to your point, I'm not sure exactly how to encourage kids other than when they're younger to try and aspire to building things. Actually, you create cities. You know, if you look at a developer's job, they create cities, yet they've been demonised to be greedy. And therefore, who would trust a developer? You know, we're touching on before the session, the whole issue, in my mind at least, as to why we've got ourselves here, especially with councils, local government, NIMBYs, YIMBYs, etc., is no one trusts each other. They all think that they're out to exploit the situation rather than make a reasonable profit or return for risk. But we all contribute to society. If we don't, then society's going to be worse off for that. So not sure how to attract kids other than let's get them someone or something to be inspired about, and then that changes their career. So, not an easy one to answer.
No, it's not, mate. You also mentioned earlier the 30 million empty bedrooms around the country. 13, yes. And we've been building the biggest houses on the planet for God knows how many years, 246 square metres on average, 4x2 with a games room, with a theatre room. Our model was we used to buy them properties, the 4x2 with the games room and the theatre room, and we used to build a wall in between the games room and the theatre room, put an ensuite in, change it from a 4-bedroom, 2-bathroom to a 6-bedroom, 4-bathroom,
right,
and then rent them rooms out individually.
Yeah, like a bit of a sort of like a boarding house.
Yeah, essentially, yeah, like roomy houses in Ultimas in Victoria. And as the model's adapted, we've started building 6-bedroom, 6-bathroom houses, and just then they've got their own kind of micro apartments around there. Because of that kind of housing mindset that we've had for such a long time, how do we change that as well? Because I still see a lot of people investing in the 4x2 on the fringes to save tax. But I feel like we're adding to the problem because these properties have been built on the fringes, not infill. They still seem to be too big from what I can understand, with 1 or 2 people living in them, but we've got 3 or 4 bedrooms. So how do we change that mindset?
Again, it's through education, I suppose, because we do live in a democracy. And if someone wants to build a big house out in the suburbs because that's what they value, then how do we stop them? Well, I'm not so sure we should stop them. I think maybe we should inform them and guide them about what the implications are, both from a sustainability point of view, from a long-term running cost point of view, and from an economic point of view. But that takes time, because if you look at the whole Australian dream, it's actually a cultural thing that we've got ingrained subconsciously. That takes time to change. So we have to be recognising that these things take time and have a more of a longer term strategy, and we educate to allow behaviours to change over the long term. Anything forced down someone's throat, they take a negative reaction to it, right? And notice that same thing with our kids, right? When we try and tell them what to do, they don't listen to us, but they listen to our friends, you know. So, but yeah, just a long-term approach.
Yeah,
there's nothing short about anything we do.
Podcasts, documentaries, all the stuff that we're doing now.
Get people to think,
yeah,
right? It goes back to what I said before about we're trying to create respectful unrest to generate political self-interest. You only do that through education. And sometimes we try and force things down people's throat or the community's throat in a very short space of time because there's elections on, rather than bring them on the journey through subsequent years so that both sides, this should become bipartisan really, so that both sides educate people about the long-term implications of behaviour slightly change. We can't just knee-jerk when it suits us. We have to have a more strategic approach to the way that our country is going to prosper. And at Housing All Australians, we believe that housing is fundamental economic infrastructure for a future prosperous Australia. Because, well, without shelter, as we said earlier, there's unintended human consequences. We have to be a bit smarter than that.
Our vision at the HMO Property Co is a world where everyone has access to housing because it's a basic human right.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting, and I don't want to debate you on that, but let me ask you a question. The word human right has a number of different perceptions. Half the population believes, half refuse it.
Yeah, true.
We don't go down that route. We say it's a fundamental human need. No one disagrees with that. We must use language that unites people, not what they rights. Yeah. Because again, the words, the semantics are quite important sometimes. And it's not that anyone's right or wrong. It's that it causes an argument about something that doesn't need to be argued about.
True.
So we've gone back and say it's a fundamental human need. And no one disagrees with that because we're all human beings.
That's it.
But rights, people have a perception, rightly or wrongly, what that actually means. So I think we use the word need.
Yes. Yeah. Good. Before we get into the PRADS model, can we talk about the Wind Car project that you just completed in Western Australia?
Yes. Wind Car House was something that we did with Uniting.
Yeah.
It's 12 homes for vulnerable women, or rooms, because it's quite a big complex. It started off several years ago when we approached Uniting with our approach about engaging the private sector on a pro bono basis to incubate new developments, because the Wind Car House was an old house just sitting there vacant. So Lee Rosetto, who is a partner of Minter Ellison, is a Western Australian chair, got Cox Architecture, RPS, and a whole group of compassionate capitalists together, and they provided all the services that they got the town planning permit for Wind Car House. Then we started to talk, and this when COVID disrupted things. We should have been on site sod turning a couple of years ago, but then builders were going to go broke, and in Western Australia the market's quite difficult at the moment. So it's taken several years, but there's nearly $1 to $2 million of pro bono support from the private sector that incubated the Wind Car House, which was released just 2 days ago.
Yeah,
and again, it's pro bono from private sector. And what happens? Well, geez, we've incubated this. We did the pro bono, and then United applied to the state to have some funds to build it. And because you've leveraged the private sector, the state gave them $7 million, I think it was, to build it.
Yeah.
So with the sod turning was a couple of days ago by the Housing and Homelessness Mr. Carey, I believe his name. Yeah. And it's our first project in Western Australia, which Lee and the team were very proud of, and I'm ecstatic by what Lee's done in Western Australia. So, and we're looking at others now too, because people are coming forward to saying, would you believe we've got 30 or 40 empty townhouses on some of these not-for-profit sites that they can't economically develop? They will one day. Let's use them for short-term shelter.
It does help, mate. If we can help in any way, let me know.
Yeah, well, definitely. You're definitely on the cards now.
Yeah. Let's talk about the PRADS model,
Yep.
because I was reading through the document that you sent me. Impressive. Break it down for us.
Well, it started off during the Rudd era. They introduced what they call National Rental Affordability Scheme, called NRAS.
Yeah.
And when I was at Fraser's, we used NRAS to sell property. And for your listeners, NRAS is basically at a below-market rent, but it's topped up by federal and state tax subsidies that allow you to get a bit more, from a return point of view, it's actually more attractive than just renting it to the general market. And there was 32,000 NRAS properties across Australia. And as I said, as Fraser's, we used it to sell property. But we did it on one condition, though, is that we had to be the face of the property management. Because rightfully or wrongfully, one of the developer's job is to risk mitigate. And sales risk is quite important. We had a project with several stages to go, which is another 5 to 10 years. If for some reason the public thought that we were tenning it to public housing, rightfully or wrongfully, it could impact the sales pricing of the subsequent stages. So we had to manage that perception. So Fraser's were the property manager of the NRAS and are still doing it today, even though it's coming towards the end of the 10 years.
Yeah. Is that 2026 when it ends?
It varies. It all depends on when it starts, but
Right.
a 10-year period. But when I left Fraser's, I was talking to not-for-profits because, I left to try and disrupt this affordable housing space, having seen the magnitude of the issue. And I was talking to some of the community housing providers, knowing the scale of the problem. And in Victoria specifically, there was voluntary agreements where the developer and the council must do some affordable housing. The developer says, yes, I'm happy to sell it to the not-for-profit for 80% of market rent, of market value. The not-for-profit says, but we've got no cash because they need to get equity from government. The government says they've got no cash, right? So rather than selling, I'm picking number 10, they said, just give us 2 for free, right? Because it costs the same to the developer. And I said to the not-for-profit, well, if you're really serious about solving this problem, why don't you get the 10, but just take it as a rental? In other words, just take it as the management, because the cost to the developer of the 10 at 80% of market is the same as the 2 gifting. So the maths are pretty simple. We have to look at how we scale it up. And their response was, we'd rather get them for free. right? So in other words, different objectives in terms of the scale of investors. So if you go back to the trust question, as a developer and talking about compassionate capitalist, right? Let's assume for the moment that we declare war on housing. And why I say that word, because war enemies should come together in the national interest. And I would talk to you, council, I'd love to put some essential worker housing on my project, but I'm not a charity. You've got the levers to add value to my land in terms of planning density. We'll go through a process where any additional value you give me, or any time you give me, you saving the time, I'll return that back to you as the subsidy needed for the affordable homes. So it's a cash neutral, but it's value creation. Then what we do with the PRADS model is then you put it on title and you lock it in through a restrictive covenant, we believe, for at least 30 years. And then you can sell it to mum and dad investor. You've just unlocked private sector capital to drive affordable housing. But then the question comes, yes, but how do you know in 10 years' time it still is affordable? Fair question. So PEXA is creating a digital affordable housing register called the PRADS register, where compliance of all stakeholders are transparent on the register. So if you go back to the NRAS, there was a compliance process. In simple terms, assume that's all digitalised, as opposed to plunky emails, attachments of stat decks, income statements, bank statements, all that stuff, right? So it's fully digitalised. And therefore, you can monitor someone for 30 years, maybe even in perpetuity, because it's all technology-based. But think of it a bit even more strategic, because the word affordable housing has different perceptions around the country. It's very confusing. There's no one single definition. And people say, but affordable housing, social housing. Well, yes, no, it's confusing, right? But what I think is potentially a game changer, this is where realestate.com comes in. We've been working for them for several months, and we've come to the view that if government cannot create a ecosystem where there's a clear definition of what affordable housing is, which is really essential worker housing, let us as industry create it. So as of July this year, PRADS is searchable on realestate.com for essential key worker housing. Industry is now defined. If you're on the PRADS register, you're an essential key worker.
Yep.
The real estate industry that didn't want anything to do with affordable housing because they thought it was social housing, say, we'll lease to key workers. We just don't want anything to do with affordable housing. We've just engaged the entire property ecosystem through a definition for renting key essential worker housing by being on the PRADS register. So we think this is a game changer. It's still got several months to go. Yeah. We are talking to state governments, federal government. Everyone's keen on this register because it's a bit of a no-brainer, but it's still like wading through treacle, right? But if we're going to solve it, we want to use technology. But go one step further, because in Victoria, and I know this is done federally, is there's income bands that say these are the qualifications for federal support for key workers. So there's income band definitions.
Yep.
Which is fair. You've got to have definitions. What technology allows you to do is every local government area can have their own income bands. Because to do something in Sydney is very different to do something in Fremantle.
Yes.
So let's use technology to expand its scale, the direction of essential key worker housing, using income bands that are relevant to that part of Australia. And we can then potentially have a long-term approach that actually solves the essential worker housing problem. But we have to step outside the box because, and that is a slight risk, but we do it in a robust way where we mitigate those risks. But unless we step outside the box, we'll never have any new solutions. But I'm going to tell you, staying inside the box hasn't done very well for us. So we got to take that risk in the long-term interest.
Absolutely. How would the tenants need to register on the PRADS register as well to get access to?
You've got to have to be a qualifying tenant.
Yeah.
And with NRAS, there are qualification requirements, including the income bands, the provision of statutory declarations, bank statements, all that stuff for verification. In the long term, we see this potentially linking into the Department of Social Services to verify that the tenants are actually eligible tenants. So in my mind, because we're about to start developing it, when someone looks at realestate.com, they find an affordable home in Fremantle on the PRADS register. They then type in all their information and the system will tell you automatically where you qualify. You then need to supplement that by all the other stuff I mentioned. But then you go on the list like a normal tenant does. You've been pre-qualified as the key worker, and then the real estate agent does what they do best, which is then qualify the tenant, select one, and put it in there. And the agent must use the portal, because you must put on every couple of years there's a valuation process to make sure what is the market rent, what is the 70% below market rent, to make sure it's fully transparent over the long term. So yes, we must embrace technology to help us with the housing crisis, because the current, what I call analog system, is very, very inefficient. We've got to use digital technology to actually help us.
We're living in a digital world, aren't we?
We are. So let's embrace it.
Yeah. Robert, it's been a pleasure catching up with you today, mate. I feel like we talk about this for hours on end, but what's your predictions for the cricket over the weekend?
Well, it's going to be interesting. I hope it doesn't rain, but let's hope it's a great game. I'm not going to pick sides, even though obviously we're Australian, but I'll just hope it's an exciting game and it's close, and and we all, Australia wins. Yeah.
Thank you very much for joining us on the podcast, mate. It's been an absolute pleasure.
It's a pleasure, and thank you very much for the opportunity to share what some of us are trying to do. But seriously, if you are a business that you want to help Australians in the future, and you consider yourself to be a compassionate capitalist, get in touch with us through our website, because we'd love to talk to you.
Yeah. We'll also put the links to the website, the Netflix doco, and all the other things that we mentioned in here today in the show notes of the podcast.
That would be great.
Robert, it's been a pleasure.
Thanks, Neil.
Thank you.
Thanks for watching. Make sure you tune in the same time next week so you can stay up to date with all cash flow positive property updates.